I want to start talking about the mode dial for normal stills shooting. The mode dial up here, you're going to notice four letters, P, S, A, and M. And something else I want you to notice is that when I go to aperture priority mode, you're going to see that we have this blue highlight. When I go to S, or shutter priority mode, we get SS highlighted. Notice that F is in red. When I go to P, we get this shutter speed indicator. But this blue is telling us which of the settings is the priority. What this means is that as I change my aperture, you'll notice that the aperture is changing directly, but the shutter speed is also changing. What is going on here? So the easiest way for me to explain this is on aperture priority mode. And when we're in aperture priority mode, you'll notice that we get this blue highlight. That blue highlight in the aperture priority and the shutter priority mode is telling us which of the settings we are responsible for. This means that we change the aperture in aperture priority mode, and the camera will make the adjustments to the shutter speed. So aperture works, very low numbers are wide apertures. When we get into these much larger numbers, like f22, this is a very small opening. It lets in less light. And you'll notice that as you change your aperture setting, the shutter speed is changing. The camera is doing it for us. And another question you should be thinking about is that if the aperture is going from small to wide and wide to small, how come the exposure doesn't change, right? What's happening is the camera is trying to keep this as an even exposure. So when I change the aperture and make it smaller, it's letting in more light. It's using a longer shutter speed to balance the change in aperture. And that's what aperture priority is all about. Now, I want to show you something else that's super important is take your hand and move it in front of the camera just like this. And watch what happens to the shutter speed. So the shutter speed is actually changing, and I'll just cover it, because there's less light coming in. The camera's saying, hey, I'm in a situation where there's not enough light. Let's use a longer shutter speed. Now we're at 1.3 seconds. So the way that this works is the camera is constantly measuring how much light is coming through the lens, and it's adjusting the shutter speed depending on your shooting environment. I get tons of emails. Why is it that my shutter speed is so long? Well, usually because you're inside. If you walk outside on a sunny day, you're going to notice that in aperture priority mode, the camera is going to use a very fast shutter speed. So your lighting conditions also matter. Which brings us to the all-important question, how do we change the brightness of our image? Exposure is a fancy way of saying brightness. And this is going to be one of the most common things that will happen to you is you'll take a picture and you're going to want it to be brighter. The short answer is we are going to adjust our exposure compensation, which is done with the rear thumb dial. So as I rotate it to the right, you're going to notice over here on the far left, this exposure compensation bracket. We get this half moon highlight in blue that's telling us that we control it with the rear thumb wheel. And when I rotate this and that yellow tick mark goes up, you'll notice the screen is getting brighter. I'm going to put it to that 1 and take a picture. Now, when I compare those two images, that last one I just took and the one before, you will see the one I just took is brighter. So the short answer is that we can change exposure compensation with the rear control wheel to make our images brighter or darker. That's the short answer. In aperture priority mode, and this is going to work in a similar way in the program mode, P, S mode, shutter speed priority, and aperture priority mode. I mainly want you to shoot with aperture priority as soon as possible. Now, there is a long answer to this. It's going to take a little bit of explanation. I'm going to adjust, let's see here, my aperture to get to 1/60th. Okay. You're going to notice on this bracket that we have positive numbers going up and negative numbers going down. What do those numbers mean? Each number is a stop. One stop of light is twice the amount of light as the previous stop. So when I rotate the exposure compensation thumb wheel to +1, We have twice as much light here as we did before, and there's a way to mathematically prove this. Look at our shutter speed, 1/60th of a second. And as I rotate the thumb wheel up, you can see that the shutter speed is changing. The aperture and the ISO are not. So when I get to +1, I'm now at 1/30th of a second. And the math actually works out because 1/60th plus 1/60th is 2/60ths, which is simplified to 1/30th. So that's how exposure compensation works. We're giving the camera instructions to cheat the shutter speed to make the image brighter or darker. So if we go in the opposite direction, let's go to -1. 1/125th of a second is 2 times faster than 1/60th of a second. It's not perfect, but it's in that ballpark. If we were to continue to go down, 1/250th of a second is twice as fast as the previous. And if you said 1/500th of a second for -3, you are absolutely correct. So that is how exposure compensation works. Each of those little tick marks between each number is 1/3 of a stop. So we can change our brightness in aperture priority mode by adjusting our exposure compensation. Now, there is a word of warning I have to give you, is that if you're hand holding the camera, you definitely want to have a shutter speed. If you're just taking pictures of people or things that are not moving, at 1/60th of a second. If it's a longer shutter speed than 1/60th of a second, your images are going to be blurry because our hands move as we're holding the camera. As we're standing, we're swaying a little bit, or our subject might move. Anything less than 1/60th of a second, you're going to start running into problems. And in fact, I like 1/100th of a second when I'm hand holding because I get even fewer of these motion blur type images. If you are a sports shooter, it will need to be faster. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you're shooting portraits with aperture priority, you're going to want 1/60th of a second. I can open my aperture a little bit more to let in more light, and it's using a faster shutter speed. This is all something going to become very intuitive as you continue to shoot. Some people are surprised when I tell them, as a wedding photographer, I shot tons on aperture priority mode because I'm very busy, I'm remembering names, and it's really great when you're going from a dark environment, like inside of a church, and you start backing up as the couple's walking out, and now you're in the lobby. It's a different lighting situation in that lobby. The camera is going to use a faster shutter speed. And now, now we're outside and it's a bright sunny day. The camera makes the adjustment to the shutter speed and I don't have to worry about it. So if I'm dealing with a situation where time is short, aperture priority mode. If I have plenty of time, studio setting, strobe setting, I'm almost always on manual. Those are the two modes I use more than anything. Let's talk about shutter priority. And in this case, you'll see that the shutter is set with our front dial. It's highlighted in blue. And we can rotate it, but there is a problem here. We're getting this red indication with our aperture. What's going on? Well, let me also say that for sports shooting, you're going to want to use a faster shutter speed. Typically, I like to use a shutter speed of about 1/500th of a second to start. Some sports vary a little bit. Small children aren't quite as fast, but yeah, human athletes, adults, 1/500th of a second, for something like basketball, minimum. You may need something even more, 1/1000th of a second. If you're doing birds in flight, you're going to need even a faster shutter speed, 1/2000th or even faster. But the very beginning for me for sport shooting is 1/500th of a second. I inspect the images. If I have motion blur, I use a faster shutter speed. So we have a problem now. The aperture is in red. And what is happening is the camera's warning us. If you take a picture, it's going to be underexposed. That's basically what it's saying. Because you play it back, this is what it looks like. This is the camera complaining. Camera is not happy. And it's telling us the aperture, I have the 16-55 2.8. It's a very wide aperture. It's an amazing lens, but it is limited to 2.8. It cannot open any wider. I want you to think about this and ask yourself, if you were in a situation where you needed that 1/500th of a second and you saw this as red, what are you going to do? That is exactly Right. This is why I taught you ISO earlier. We're going to bump our ISO up to the point that that redness goes away. Still not enough. Still got to bump it up. Wow. We're in a really not well lit situation. There it goes. So at ISO 6400, it disappears and you can see the f-stops at f4. So we could probably use a faster shutter speed. And as we increase it, you can see the camera is making the adjustment to the aperture. So this is how shutter priority works, is that we change the shutter speed and the camera makes the adjustments to the aperture. Same case as if we were to take our hand and put it over the lens. You can see it's already changing the aperture. And when there's not enough light, the camera starts complaining again. Hey, we don't got enough light. This is not going to be an even exposure. That's the heart of the matter of shutter priority. And again, sports start at 1/500th of a second. That's a good place to start. Small children, maybe 1/250th would be enough. In the case of changing our exposure, it's the same thing as before. We rotate the exposure compensation wheel, and the adjustment this time is happening to the aperture. It's the opposite of aperture priority. We adjust the shutter speed, the camera adjusts the aperture. For brightness control, exposure control, and that's how shutter priority works. Let's turn the dial to the P mode. P is a little different. It's a little wacky because what happens is the camera is going to give us different settings and different combinations. You can think of it as shutter priority, but there's a little bit more going on here and it's a little bit easier to use. It's sort of like taking the training wheels off a little bit. When I shoot with Canon cameras and flash at events, P mode is great because it's the handheld flash mode. But the idea here is the camera is going to give us different settings and we can just glance at the settings and see if they're good enough for us, right? Exposure compensation works the same. We rotate our exposure compensation wheel, but you can see now it's adjusting it with shutter speed. And if we go up high enough, it'll change to aperture. So the summary of program mode is that we can dial in a setting, our shutter speed, and the camera can make different adjustments based on the lighting conditions, situation we're in, subject matter, and it can change either one of them. Let's take a look real quick at the manual mode. You know you're in manual mode when both of these are blue, and we're way overexposed right now. Our ISO is really high, so I'm going to turn the ISO back down. Manual mode is exactly what it sounds like. We control both the shutter speed, and we have the half moon front dial here, and the aperture. Shutter speed right here. In the case of this particular setup, I'm using my aperture control ring to change the aperture. The camera's not going to change anything. And we dial in the ISO. It's just exactly what we tell the camera to do. It's very obedient. I typically shoot in manual when I am not rushed and I have plenty of time to inspect my images and to make adjustments as I see fit. Strobe shooting almost exclusively in manual. One of the most common questions that I get is in regards to auto ISO. So typically, I prefer my students to dial in their ISO directly because I think it helps them learn. However, we have a setting in here called auto ISO, and we get some of these other items here over here on the right. These are limits in terms of how high and how low we want our auto ISO to work. So let's just keep it, let's do 160 on the low end, and we'll turn it up to 12,800 on the high end. We also have a minimum shutter speed, and I'm going to select, in this case, 1/100th of a second. Come out. So what does auto ISO do for us, and when would we use it in something like a manual shooting mode? Auto ISO gives the camera permission to change the ISO settings automatically without our permission. The best example I can think of is indoor sport shooting, something like MMA fighting, where you have lights flashing on and off and different angles of light. And depending on where the subject matter is, as they're coming into the stadium, disco settings, certain concerts where we have conditions where light is rapidly changing from second to second. This is where I would go with auto ISO. If it was doing MMA, I would dial in my shutter speed, something like 1/500th of a second. I personally would probably go with the widest aperture and then let the camera deal with the ISO between those shots. This is a little high. If I didn't like this, I could come in and turn this down 6400, tap the shutter button, and so you can see that it's not going to go higher than 6400. It's a really good way to use auto ISO, rapid light changing conditions where we have to dial in a specific setting. These other settings in here, when I press the ISO button, so this minimum shutter speed would be appropriate when we're shooting in something like shutter priority and we want to limit the shutter speed that the camera will use. In manual mode, it doesn't apply because we just dial it in. So there is a hidden mode on the mode dial when we're on manual called the bulb mode. And I'm going to turn off auto ISO. Just go back to regular ISO for now. We can pull the bulb mode up by dialing our shutter speed to a very long shutter speed over, I think it's 30 seconds. Oh, 60, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. There it is. So we can change our shutter speed to very long exposures. There's 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 15-minute shutter speed, bulb. Bulb basically means is that we push the shutter button down, hold it down, and as long as we're holding the shutter button down, the exposure is happening, and then when we release it, the exposure ends. Obviously, that's going to be a very bright image because we were just soaking the sensor with light. So it's going to be pure white. That is how you access bulb mode. And to get back into our regular shooting, we just come back down to much faster shutter speeds. Again, we're in manual mode in order to access this. Something else that you're going to notice on the mode dial up here is that we have these different numbers, C1 through C7. We've got a lot of custom modes. What are they all about? I'm going to continue to show you some other features of the camera, like the drive modes, the focusing mode. We have film simulations. We have electronic, mechanical. We have all of these different settings that are great for different situations. And it's nice to not have to redial those in every time by selecting a custom position and saving those settings. So as you come in and you're changing all your settings up, once you set your camera up exactly the way you want it, including the Q settings, the menu settings, you'll notice that when we come into the menu, it tells us that we're in custom 1. We want to come to the IQ tab. It's on the very top, page 3 out of 4, and edit to save custom settings. We can come in and save the current settings, hit OK. The camera will remember those settings as we dialed it in. Something else we can do is that we can change the shooting mode for this custom setting, depending on which one it is. So we have some ability to edit them a little bit in the. I think it's easier just to do it and then just to save it. It's essentially letting us edit different settings of this C1 position in the menu. There's so many different customizations you can do in here. It's ridiculous. We can hit back, save it. We can copy those settings. We can reset, edit the custom name for it, type in a name. Pretty amazing. But the idea is that we can save it to a specific setting. When we come out, we have a couple other features, including auto update custom setting. This means that if we are in a C1 through C7 mode and we're changing our camera settings, it will remember those changes if it's enabled. And we can also determine whether or not this is a still custom setting or a video custom setting, depending on what you do more of. If you want to have, and we have 7 position for it, which is amazing. It's really nice. And that is how we set up our custom modes. You will also notice that on the mode dial, we have this filter setting. I don't really see these as professional tools, but they're kind of fun to play with. You're going to come in to your shooting setting. Your filter setting is going to determine which of these filters is active on your mode dial. So the first one is a toy camera. It'll give you a toy camera look, a miniature look, pop colors, high key. We can't really see because we've got these blinds, but if you go out and play around with, they're kind of fun, a little gimmicky, but that's what that's all about. So I'm going to leave it on toy camera for now. Come back out to our aperture priority mode. And if we're talking about filters, this might be a good place to talk about film simulations on the back of our dial here. If I push to the left by default, Fuji's famous for having different film simulations. I recommend that in the beginning, just stick with the standard until you get the idea of focusing and exposure settings. But we had Velvia, Astia, Classic Chrome, Pro Negative High, Pro Negative Standard. And these are all going to give, this is very popular for filmmakers, they all give different looks. And we can tweak these looks a little bit because you can see we have this arrow to the right on some of them, right? If I press Q, we can read a little bit about it. And these are definitely something you're going to want to take a look at. But for now, when you're beginning the camera, just keep it on standard.